Anna, not Glory.
Pleased to meet you and
Yes.
good to see you.
The name is because we generated the panelist link. We didn't have your personal email, so we sent it to Glory and James.
Okay, thank you.
So Diana, if I haven't heard from Jeff, but if Jeff shows up, I want to start with him. But if not, maybe I'm going to start with you if that's okay.
Absolutely, whatever you want, Jim. You are in charge. You're the expert.
I know that's always a scary thought, isn't it? So.
No, Jim's in charge. Oh.
I've just got a couple more minutes.
So what time is it in Sri Lanka?
It is 7:27 to be exact in Colombo.
Okay.
So we must be about how much? 10.5 hours or 9.5 hours? Advance?
9 o'clock here. 9 a.m. here in Washington, D.C.
10.5 hours.
Huh?
10.5
10
hours.
I see.
Jim, can you see me? I can't see myself.
Mike, I cannot see you, and weirdly, I cannot. I don't see you on the thing, which is weird. Diana, can you hear Mike?
I can hear you. I can hear everybody, and I can see the ambassador. I can see a lot of people. I can see the
Can you see
admiral.
me?
I can see, yes, loud and clear. Yes, you're wearing your coat, tie.
Yes.
Thank
you.
Well, we can see you, Jim.
No, somebody else. Can they rename themselves?
This is camera on or camera off?
Well, thanks for joining, Mike. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Your perspective on trying to explain American politics is really appreciated, and I don't know anybody else that could actually do that. So.
All right. I think it is time is right. Let us begin. If I may say a few words first.
Absolutely.
I'm Bernard Gunathilaka, chairman of the Pathfinder Foundation. First of all, greetings from the Pathfinder Foundation to the heritage team of presenters, the Sri Lankan team of commentators, and participants within and outside Sri Lanka participating in today's program, jointly organized by the Washington-based Heritage Foundation and Colombo-based Pathfinder Foundation. Interactions between our two institutions date back to over a decade. Given the significant developments of our two countries have experienced during the last year, 2024, we have jointly decided to organize today's program. Sri Lanka has faced numerous political and economic challenges since 2019. In 2022, the democratically elected president was ousted following public protests, and the country was declared bankrupt due to its inability to service its external debts. Ultimately, the government was compelled to agree to restructure its debts and seek the assistance of the IMF. Although these issues have been largely addressed, economically speaking, the country is still not out of the woods. Sri Lanka held its presidential election followed by a parliamentary election in September and November last year. The results of these two elections did not surprise the voters in Sri Lanka, unlike those outside the country. A noteworthy aspect was that a political party which had led two unsuccessful armed conflicts armed conflicts against the state in the early 1970s and late 1980s, and had only 3 parliamentary seats, successfully transformed itself into a dynamic political force capable of defeating traditional political parties which ruled the country for over 7 decades. Even more remarkable was the party's ability to gain trust of the Tamil population, particularly in the north and the east of the country. The stronghold of the LTT, I presume all of you know what it was rather, surpassing the traditional Tamil political parties that had long dominated those 2 provinces. Around the same time, the US presidential election saw President Donald Trump returning to lead the country. Given that these political changes in the United States and Sri Lanka occurred almost concurrently, and considering the potential impact of the new US administration's policies locally and globally, we decided to collaborate with the Heritage Foundation to understand the evolving situation better. We are pleased that the Heritage Foundation has assembled an experienced team of folk to focus on critical areas of US policy. The team will cover topics such as US energy policy, China policy, economic and trade policy, US politics, and South Asia policy. Our bilateral relations are centuries old and time-tested. However, since the US and Sri Lanka have new administrations, considering our multifaceted relationships, we wish to understand how the new US policy under second Trump administration would impact the South Asian region in general and Sri Lanka in particular. The Pathfinder Foundation experts can explain the situation from Sri Lankan's perspective. Since we are focusing on several major US policy areas, perhaps Heritage and Pathfinder should consider jointly focusing on specific areas of interest in time to come. In closing, I would like to extend my gratitude to the Heritage team for their involvement in today's event, and to James Carafano, Senior Counselor of the Heritage Foundation, for coordinating this briefing session. I look forward to our 2 institutions holding similar sessions in the future when needed. That is the end of my introductory remarks. Mr. Carafano, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. So we have you maybe adjustments this morning because there's a lot of flu and other things going around here, but we've got some excellent presenters. So I think we'll start off with Diana, who I'll let introduce herself to talk about energy and environmental policy, probably the single most transformative and significant shift from the previous administration. So I think her remarks are really important. So Diana, you can take as long as you need. Then we'll move on to Mike Gonzalez. Mike's probably the most astute political analyst in America to explain how American politics are changing. And I think that is significantly important we try to understand both U.S. foreign and domestic policy. So I think it's really important context. Eric will cover the very extremely non-controversial trade and economic issues. Oh, and Jeff's here. Jeff, what's your time schedule like? Do you need to go first? Would that be easier?
No, I have a little bit of time. I'm here until 10.
Okay. All right. I think that's going to work then. And then if that's perfect. And then so we'll get Jeff in to talk about South Asia and policy and security policy. And that should be a great set of briefings. That ought to take us right to about 10 o'clock. So I'll let the presenters introduce themselves, talk for a bit. We might have time for a question or two, and then we'll move on. So Diana, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. So I direct the Center on Energy, Climate, and Environment, which was set up a couple of years ago by a new president, Kevin Roberts, and I was brought in to head it. I'm an economist. I worked in the Reagan administration at the Council of Economic Advisors, both Bush administrations. I was chief of staff of the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House under President George W. Bush, and also chief economist at the Labor Department. And under the Trump administration, I served in the Treasury Department as Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy on an acting level, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology in the Transportation Department. And as you know, transportation and energy are very closely linked. Well, I've been asked to speak for 4 or 5 minutes and then take questions. I'm very much looking forward to your questions. So I'd just like to do a very brief overview. And you mentioned that the president of Sri Lanka had to resign. One of those reasons was that he did not want to have chemical fertilizers, as we understand it here. So the price of food went up very substantially because it was difficult to produce without these chemical fertilizers. You must correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very important to have energy security. Energy security is food security. There's a dramatic difference between President Biden and President Trump on energy policy, probably one of the largest differences in any area except perhaps defense. President Biden had a war against fossil fuels. He had executive orders which shrank the national monuments, making it more difficult to develop our oil and natural gas resources. He didn't want development of oil and natural gas offshore. He wanted to require electric vehicles rather than gasoline-powered vehicles. And this raises the costs of energy and transportation. And it doesn't make sense for the United States because the United States has a lot of oil and natural gas. Plus, from a geopolitical perspective, 7 out of the largest 10 solar and wind companies are in China. China makes 80% of the world's electric batteries. So by requiring electrification and renewables, this made the United States dependent on China. So when President Trump came in, he did a complete reversal. He had executive orders that rolled back the incentives for renewables. He took off the requirement that Americans had to buy a certain share of electric vehicles by 2032. And he said American dominance is important. We can produce our own oil and natural gas. And that's less expensive because if you look at wind and solar, the wind blows for free, the sun shines for free, but they don't blow. The wind doesn't blow all the time. The sun doesn't shine all the time. So backups are necessary. It's as though I said to you, Mr. Admiral, I'm going to give you a free car. And I'm going to give you a beautiful Mercedes, but you can only drive it during the day. And Mr. Admiral, you might say to me, but I like to drive at night. I say, well, too bad, you've got to have another car. And you say to me, but that means I have to put gasoline in 2 cars. I have to take my car twice to be maintained, 2 cars to be maintained, 2 sets of emissions tests, 2 sets of cleaning. Why do I need 2 cars? Well, it's the same with wind and solar. If you had a natural gas power plant, the one that backs up the wind farm, and had it run continuously all the time, it would be less expensive than having a natural gas power plant and a wind farm go on and off when the wind stops blowing. It's much more expensive. And we have a beautiful paper on the Heritage website called Why Electricity Prices Are Soaring in Blue States. And one of the nice things about America is that we have 50 different states. So we can do 50 different experiments and see what works and what doesn't work. And the 10 most expensive states in terms of electricity prices all have requirements for renewables, wind and solar. So the top price in the mainland United States is 32 cents per kilowatt hour. The bottom 10 states in terms of electricity prices, with one exception, each of these has one exception, by the way, but the bottom 10 states do not require any wind and solar. And the lowest price is Utah, which is 11 cents per kilowatt hour. So you have California with very great requirements for wind and solar, 3 times the price of electricity as Utah and Louisiana. So we can see what makes inexpensive electricity. And why is this important? Because if we have inexpensive electricity, we can attract manufacturing from all over the world, including places like Germany, where it's got more expensive. So this is very, very important to President Trump. He wants more jobs in the United States. He wants more manufacturing. And that's why he is focusing on inexpensive energy. Well, politics is full of surprises. No one knew that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. No one knew that Iran-backed Hamas was going to invade Israel. But one thing that should not be a surprise is energy policy. Countries should make sure that they have a reliable, affordable supply of energy and that they're not dependent on countries that are not friendly towards them. So we have an ideal North American energy platform here in the United States. We import what's called heavy crude, sour crude, from Mexico and Canada. We refine it in our refineries, and then we ship it back to Canada and Mexico in the form of gasoline and heating oil. China also wants to be energy independent. China doesn't have oil and natural gas. It has coal. That's why it is electrifying its fleet of cars, because that way it can run its cars off electricity powered by its coal-fired power plants. You might say to me, well, Diana, what about emissions? Don't you care about climate change? Well, climate change is a future risk to be managed. Poverty is a problem that is with us right now. There's 3 billion people in the world without electricity and running water, and they cannot get there through renewables. It doesn't make any sense to ask countries that have never carbonized to decarbonize. Everybody wants standards of living where you can have electricity, running water, and to end with and renewables cannot provide that in a reliable manner, because you always need a backup. It's like the example of 2 cars. So I just want to end with one small story before I take your questions. I'm originally from the United Kingdom. My father came from London to work in Washington, and he called back to London from Washington to my mother, and he said, we have to move to America. In America, they heat the bathrooms. So cheap and inexpensive energy provides a lot of creature comforts, and that's one reason that I'm here in America today. So with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I would say maybe if there's one question before we move on, that would be great. I mean, if somebody does have a question, it'd be great if they would just raise their hand with the little hand raising function. But we're going to come back and do more questions at the end as well.
So shall we Jim, go through the rest of the speakers and
sure, absolutely.
take the time to ask questions? I think that will be more productive.
Okay, thank you. So I think Steve Yates also joined us. We're trying to get him online. He's our China expert, and he'll be briefing us on China as well. But as we try to figure that out, let me turn it to Mike. Ask Mike to introduce himself, and then I think talk through maybe the most complicated thing to understand about U.S. policy. So, Mike, over to you.
Can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you well, and we can see you.
Yes, good. So Diana is a very, very tough act to follow because she's so comprehensive and knowledgeable and a great colleague. I am Mike Gonzalez. I write about many issues here. I write books. I covered a lot of ground on foreign policy, but also the cultural battles here in this country, and I delve into the political analysis. I was a journalist for many years, including 10 years in Asia, mostly with the Wall Street Journal. So I used to edit copy from Sri Lanka. I'm well aware of your country, though I've never visited, but I hear it's pure paradise. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth. Um, so uh, you hearing a lot of noise about what is going on in Washington these days, and you're likely to hear more. You probably have questions about what is taking place. And I have news for you. You will hear much more noise in for quite a lot longer. One of the reasons why our politics have been so brutal for the past few years as compared to before is that we haven't had normal politics for the last 10 years or so. We've had regime politics. If you will, we've had one constitution vying against another constitution. You have the Constitution of 1787, which is the only constitution that we have, and then we have a rival constitution that the left likes to think exists, which is a living constitution, which violates many of the tenets of the written constitution. So behind this empty noise, behind this noise that you hear, it's not just empty noise. It's a real struggle taking place. In what I will posit today for you is that what you're witnessing right now, we're witnessing historic times. We're witnessing the first real transfer of power since 1933, since FDR first came in after the 32 election, after he defeated Herbert Hoover. What is happening here in Washington and in the U.S. in general is regime change, such as we haven't seen in a century, and we have seen very few times in our nation's history. Obviously, the Civil War, and when President Jackson came in the late 1820s. Yes, we've had many changes in administrations before. They happen every 8 years at least, sometimes every 4 years. But while the person who inhabits the Oval Office changes, and the 15 cabinet positions change with different heads of agencies and departments coming in with each administration, the power balance does not change in this town. I think it's changing now. I think the power balance is changing now. So what do I mean by that? The president may change, the Congress may change, but the permanent bureaucracy has remained in place since FDR's time. What the media likes to call the fourth estate, the fourth branch of government. And that is permanent, right? So it doesn't change. It's a permanent state. It's a permanent bureaucracy. Except that if you read the Constitution of 1787, there is no fourth branch. It's illegal and unconstitutional. And more, besides that, the cultural backdrop has not shifted much either from administration to administrations before. Donald Trump, for example, was a very different man from Barack Obama when he came in 2017. But when he came into office, the country continuing the same woke spiral that it had been on for the previous 5 to 10 years. Kids continue to be mutilated in sex change operations. Universities and places of work continue to make big decisions on hiring and promotion based on race, not based on merit. So things did not really change culturally when Donald Trump came in 2017. All of that is changing now. The administrative state has been permanent until now. Now it's met its match. Because President Trump and Elon Musk, as you probably are very well aware, are taking a chainsaw to it, not just a sledgehammer, but a chainsaw that actually it's as a prop. Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, who likes to wield it, an actual chainsaw, he gave one to Elon Musk, and I think that was a very apt metaphor. Trump has issued 75 executive orders in his first 28 days in office, which means that he will very likely break FDR's record of 99 in FDR's first 100 days, which has been, but people still speak about the president's 100 days because FDR got so much done, got so much accomplished in his first 100 days. I think Donald Trump is well on his way to shatter that record and then some. And these EOs are really, they're not empty. They're really changing the regulatory and cultural landscape of the country. Along with this, and I will discuss this a little bit later, I don't want to take up too much time, there has been also a very deep cultural vibe shift. So let me just look at an EO that was just issued this month, last week, in fact. It requires that agency and department leaders review all regulations to ensure that they're consistent with the law or ensure they do not impose a heavy cost on the economy. And agency leaders are asked to use enforcement discretion to deprioritize actions that stretch statutory authority or exceed constitutional powers. And of course, and also to deprioritize enforcement of regulation that takes a heavy cost, that has a heavy cost on the economy. And of course, other EOs, for example, have made it clear that diversity, equity, and inclusion, which sound nice to you, but I will explain to you later in the Q&A if you want why they're not good for the country, that diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives will no longer be tolerated in the federal workforce, in federal contractors and grantees, in universities or education or high schools or K through 12 education, and they will even be discouraged in the private sector. Another EO declared what a government should never have to declare because it should be obvious and has been obvious for millennia now. It said that there's no longer 57 sexes. There's now 2 sexes. So they're ending the nonsense, and people have had to change throughout the federal government, federal contractors, schools and universities. Some school districts are trying to fight this, but they're gonna lose in court, I believe. Meanwhile, an entire agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, as you well know, has been gutted. They did not just have the programs been stopped. The employees have come into headquarters, are coming into this week, actually. They're only giving 15 minutes to empty out their offices, and they're leaving. And in thousands of federal workers have been fired already. 75,000 others have accepted deferred resignation offers. That means they get to actually keep their salaries and their benefits packages till September. So that's a lot of people that are leaving the federal workforce. Yeah, this is going to end up in court, but in the meantime, like USAID, there's no putting it back together again, in my opinion. So translation, the administration is firing bureaucrats by the thousands in making sure that the bureaucrats that remain will be reined in. What we're seeing is not a change in administrations. What we're seeing is what historian Niall Ferguson is calling a national transformation. Just 10 minutes ago, it came across that universities are cutting PhD applications, but people are applying to do doctorates less and less. The Washington Post, just a very liberal newspaper, which has never endorsed a Republican, just announced this week that its editorial page will now only defend personal liberties and free markets. It's a huge change. The editor of the editorial page has left in a rush. So as with all transformations, there are winners and losers, in my opinion, and I will defend that with you if you have any questions. I think the American people are the definite winners in this, but there are many losers who will go to the courts, who will complain very loudly, and the media will amplify these complaints. So expect a very bumpy ride. President Trump and Elon Musk, if they're successful, they will change the nature of government just as much as FDR did. In fact, they're undoing the FDR and the New Deal, in my opinion, something that really needs to be undone, because it expanded government, and every time you have an expansion of government, you have a curtailment of personal freedom. I will leave it there. You know, it's the only way that I can explain the enormity, and it's really enormous, the things that are happening every day. Every day I'm surprised. I'm talking to people my age, and we never thought we'd see days like this. I also had lunch yesterday with an old friend of 40 years who's a liberal, and he's distraught. He's near tears. And it pains me to see my friend like that. But then at night, I went out and saw another friend who's also my age, who's of my same beliefs. And we just saw each other. It's like, we never thought we'd see. Reagan was an important president. Reagan did not change the nature of government as much as Donald Trump, I believe, will succeed in doing. I will stop there and leave it for the Q&As later, because I know that you have very good people with Steve Yates and Jeff Smith coming along.
Thank you, Mike. So I see Steve Yates join us. He's going to cover China, which is, I think, an issue on everybody's mind. But let me turn to Eric. Eric can introduce himself. He's going to cover trade and economic policy. And then from there, Jeff will cover South Asian policy. And Steve will cover China. So great. All right, Eric, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And good to be here. Good to see the Pathfinder Foundation here. So trade and economic policy. Jim gave me the really easy topic to brief you all on, because everything's very consistent and very clear cut. Look, to Mike's point, you have a complete undertaking of the remaking of how government works. If you all have been to Washington, have corresponded with diplomats and our staff of our consulates over the years, and traveled yourselves to Washington to see how things work, a lot of things were kind of, founded on inertia. And so from the unipolar moment, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 89, 91, if you look at how actually government was structured, not really much changed. And so you have this amount of inertia carrying forward 30 years. As we have the rise of China, which I'm sure Steve will speak to, and what that impact is at bit. But an interesting fact, as recently as 2002, the U.S. had over 28% of the global manufacturing as value, right? And now we're down to something like 16%. So that's 20 years of time. And where did manufacturing increase? It was China, right? And we have to deal with China as the preeminent adversary of the United States, because the United States made a world through its institutional efforts to support a global order of free markets, free people, and free trade. However, we had actors come into that market, into that place, and didn't respect the rules and didn't respect the institutional capacity. And some of these institutions, quite frankly, have become captured. So there are two choices of action once those institutions become captured. Either completely dismantle those institutions through a reform process, or build new institutions. I'm of no preference for either way which this goes, and I would anticipate that some institutions will be reformed, those that can be saved and can be reworked, and some will kind of go by the wayside and become irrelevant over the period of this 4 years and the next 10 years. The organization that I work for, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, the Center for National Private Enterprise, we're an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber, and we work with chambers and associations around the world. In a number of programs that we've done over the years in emerging markets has been something called the regulatory guillotine. And what I do think that you're going to see in Washington in the next 6 months, next 3 years, is in effect a regulatory guillotine. And that's actually quite good. Because working in former Soviet spaces where my career originally started, there was a lot of of policy, of regulation that had accumulated over decades of Soviet rule. And in order to kind of transfer to a free market, free society, you really had to make deep cuts into what that regulatory policy was. And I think that we have a lot of detritus, just like in a garden, right? Your growth kind of overcomes if you don't occasionally prune. And right now, the United States' regulatory policy is just an overgrown garden. And so what you see the Trump administration coming in and doing is pruning quite deeply and allowing the private sector, allowing private initiative to take the initiative and to regrow. The number one priority for this administration, in my mind, is growth. It's growth and prosperity for the American people. And they're going to pursue policies to that effect, whether it be energy policy, as Deanna has outlined, or whether it be a foreign policy or trade policy, a regulatory policy, as Mike has dived into. The other issue that I'd bring to your attention is the blending, and really this is highlighted by the Ukraine war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the blending of economic policy and national security policy. These things are top of mind, and we see, the NSC, we see the State Department, we see the Commerce Department, all working towards a blend of these policies. So it's no longer the Commerce Department shall stay in its lane and effectuate, commercial deals, trade policy. The State Department will engage in diplomatic efforts. We see a blending of these efforts because, to my mind, our primary adversary, China, blends these very concepts, right? And so if we continue to kind of treat each of these issues as distinct policy areas or policy domains, we'll never be able to adapt to our adversary and understand how our adversary is adopting. Now, there is a risk here of going too far and trying to emulate or do something, the Chinese way. The Americans are not Chinese. And so we're going to have to do things our own way. And it's going to look from the outside, as Mike referenced in the media, a bit chaotic. There's a media narrative out there that wants to build a narrative of that chaos and the dysfunction. What I would ask you to do is to pay attention to outcomes and actual actions being taken. To that end, the America First investment policy issued last Friday was a policy that Lutnick's team, Secretary Lutnick's team, was deeply involved in, and is something that is quite indicative of those policies that will be coming down the road. Something that is beneficial to friends and allies of the United States, but takes quite a hard line against Chinese investment, PRC investment into dual-use technologies, and that the economic security, national security nexus. There's a lot of other great speakers here, so I don't want to take any more time. But for Sri Lanka, there's great opportunities that I see in biotech, particularly in agriculture. So Deanna, you made the point about the fertilizer issue. So working with U.S. research institutions, U.S. agricultural conglomerates to bring in varietals that are more resistant to crop failure, more resistant to drought, is an option for further deeper engagement with the United States. And the trade deficit is something that will have to be addressed because it is quite large. So that's something that the administration, I'm doubtless will be paying attention to. I'll stop there. Thank you, and look forward to questions.
Thanks. So let me turn over to the man that needs no introduction. Jeff.
Settle down. Thank you, Jim. Thanks to everyone for joining this morning. Some of you I've had a chance to meet in person in Sri Lanka. I visited on a few occasions and really would welcome the opportunity to get back. When traveling through South Asia, visiting Sri Lanka is a breath of fresh air. My colleague Steve Yates is going to cover China next, and I think, frankly, he's going to have more to talk about than I am, because on the Asia front, South Asia has not exactly been front and center thus far. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Sometimes it's better to be off of the radar than on the radar. Um, on the South Asia front, to the degree that we have had some activity and initiatives from the administration, it has mostly come on the India portfolio. And that's, I'm sure, no surprise to you all. You have been watching the development of the US-India relationship, I'm sure, very closely. You know that President Trump has a very good working relationship with Prime Minister Modi, and that the strategic partnership between our two countries has grown pretty substantially in recent years. We do have, of course, one big data point early in the term, and that was Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States earlier this month. And so we do have a few data points, I think, that are interesting, at least on that front, that are worth reviewing. And I give Prime Minister Modi's team credit for getting him in the door early. I think he was the fourth leader to visit with fourth foreign leader to visit with President Trump. Also, I think Secretary of State Marco Rubio's very first State Department meeting, if I'm correct, was with the Quad foreign ministers. Minister Jaishankar and the Japanese and Australian foreign ministers, literally, I think within an hour of Marco Rubio becoming Secretary of State, they had a Quad foreign ministers meeting. So that does show you the ongoing commitment that this administration almost certainly will have toward the Quad, which I know is relevant to Sri Lanka, given there is sort of an Indian Ocean component to the Quad, but also probably not surprising, given that, as you know, the Trump administration was the first Trump administration was the one to revive the Quad in 2017 to begin with. And that was really based off of growing concern about China's rise that pushed India and the others to reconsider sort of getting the band back together. So I think it's safe to assume that strong Trump administration support for the Quad is going to continue into term two. But what else happened during Prime Minister Modi's visit? Well, I actually thought it was quite a substantive visit, and even more so when you consider most of the people manning this portfolio had either just arrived to their desk, 3 days earlier, or aren't even at their desk yet. So we're talking about a fairly short-staffed White House, State Department, and yet, if you read through the joint statement, Prime Minister Modi's visit, it was actually very substantive. There are a lot of, pretty meaty initiatives and commitments made. And I think that's yet another sign that the Trump administration is likely to be doubling down on the India-US partnership, which is a good thing from our perspective. The one area where we did have some friction, where I think, to Prime Minister Modi's credit, I think he navigated it well, was the subject of tariffs, which you all know is near and dear to the president's heart. He was asked about this on stage with Prime Minister Modi standing next to him. Another US president might have punted in that situation, and President Trump made it very clear that tariffs are a thing and India is going to get them to the degree that India is tariffing US goods. And, again, to their credit, I think they very quickly punted to a new topic and kept the overall tenor of the conversation very positive. They didn't let that disrupt the positive strategic initiatives that were going on. But it's also a reminder that for President Trump, even for friendly countries, fair trade is important. No one will escape the tariff threat if President Trump thinks that America is being treated unfairly economically. And he is seized with this idea of fairness and reciprocal treatment. And so, if other countries have high tariffs on US goods, and India is in fact one of those countries, you should either expect high tariffs on your exports to the US, or you should be willing to come to the table with some kind of economic deal that benefits the United States to offset those tariffs. That should not be a surprise to anybody at this point, if you've been paying attention. President Trump cares greatly about fairness in trade. And so if I were a Sri Lankan economic policymaker, I would be looking at our own tariff schedules and looking at ways to head off potentially difficult conversations. I would also be looking at opportunities for investment in the United States, right? And that's one of the best ways to appeal to President Trump, is to show how our economic relationship is beneficial to the prosperity or security of the American people. And I think, too often our foreign counterparts have been in take mode. What can the United States do for me? What can the US do in our country? What can the US invest here? And I think those conversations are fair and can continue, but you also have to flip the paradigm at some point and say, what can we also do for the US, and what profitable investments might be made in America? We also have the benefit of being, one of the most profitable, lucrative, and stable free markets in the world. So it's not as if investing in the United States needs to be some kind of slog, or loss-making venture. I mean, we have fantastic capital markets and investment opportunities. You just need to aggressively pursue them. I'll just run through maybe a couple of the takeaways from Prime Minister Modi's visit that may or may not be relevant. I thought the signing of a reciprocal defense procurement agreement was fairly significant in terms of continuing to align the two defense establishments. There was, for the first time, real mention of the F-35 fighter aircraft. The two sides have sort of been flirting with this idea for years, but there was never really a serious proposal put on the table. I'm not sure we're actually at the serious proposal stage yet, but it's gotten more official sanction and interest now under President Trump than it had at any point in the past. I do think that would be a pretty significant step. But there are also very considerable challenges before we could really fully consider a sale on a platform that important and sensitive. Excuse me. There was essentially an agreement to continue cooperation in high technology. The Biden administration had unveiled a program called ISET. The Trump administration is, unsurprisingly repackaging some of that initiative, adding different acronyms, changing the nature of the working group, but the general thrust of collaborating on high technology and defense technology is going to continue under the Trump administration. They unveiled, Prime Minister Modi loves these acronyms. I think he likes them too much personally. But they unveiled the new Compact, which is catalyzing opportunities for military partnership, accelerated commerce, and technology. So that's the new Compact agreement. There's also the Autonomous Systems Industry Alliance, Asia, and they're hoping that these can help to catalyze and really create a high technology corridor between the United States and India in both commercial and defense technologies. It's a good program. In a sign of how well we think the visit went, CNN, which isn't exactly a huge fan of President Trump or Prime Minister Modi for that matter, called the visit a masterclass in how to walk into a negotiation with President Trump and achieve the best possible outcomes. That may be stretching it a little bit, but the general sense here is that the visit helped set India-US relations on a very positive trajectory moving forward. There was some agreement on terrorism, supply chains, narcotics. I mean, the India-US relationship now really spans the gamut of cooperation, and I think the visit signaled that. So happy to take more questions at the end. I want to make sure we have enough time for Steve because while South Asia hasn't really been a huge focus to date, China really is. China has been sucking up a lot of the oxygen for obvious and legitimate reasons. So good to see you all. Happy to take some questions in a little bit. Over to you, Steve.
Oh, yours, Steve.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Pleasure to join you. Thank you for taking the time for the conversation. Really, I just want to send an echo or an amen to the things that have been said prior, because one of the biggest challenges in trying to understand how to get China policy right is doing all of the things that you need to before you address China one-on-one. And I think that this administration has had a lot of time, maybe in the wilderness for 4 years, preparing to come back, where I've never in my life seen an administration prepared in such depth and in such detail for setting the stage for dealing with a major power shift as this one has been. And so we're seeing the early stages of it, but they're very, very clear. They begin with getting our house in order and trying to reset our own capabilities. The massive announcement of the AI infrastructure initiative with $500 billion as a goal gets at everything from access to water to abundant energy and realigning a lot of our workforce. These are things that make it possible for America to be a leading high-tech export manufacturing nation, the leading one, but they're also prerequisite to resetting the balance between the United States and China on strategic competition in important areas, because one of the biggest weaknesses we have allowed ourselves fall into is overdependence on an adversary. And it may seem shocking in some ways for people to talk of China in this way. A lot of the international community has not been used to that because we had the soothing sounds of a notion that is attributed to Bob Zoellick in 2007 of aspiring toward a responsible stakeholder idea. And this is really important to understand. I hope it's not a new idea since it was around since 2007, but it's fundamental to the shift that is behind everything from what Mike and Eric and others have been talking about, is the idea that we would bring China into the family of civilized nations. We would even let them in on preferential terms where they didn't even have to meet the standards we imposed on our own citizens to access our markets, to access our key institutions, to even invest in America in critical or sensitive areas without any form of reciprocity going back into their system. And the idea was that by doing all of this, they become more like us. This is the very long-term, well-meaning, traditional American missionary impulse. And while it might be worthy in a lot of respects, there's also American commercial impulse, which is twofold. One is to make money, but the other is to make sure we're not getting ripped off. And Donald Trump comes very much out of the commercial impulse, not the missionary impulse. And it took a long time to get a top leader of the United States of America to take a cold, hard look at the bet that was made by bringing China into the World Trade Organization, by following this notion of an aspiring responsible stakeholder. But it also took another leader to help affect that view. And that leader is the one of China, Xi Jinping. Under Xi Jinping, no leader of China has done more to rally our allies to rethink what their engagement policies have been, rethink everything from the Belt and Road and maybe debt trap questions, and cause others to rethink what are the real risks in becoming increasingly dependent upon China. There are two areas that have been front and center in the early stages of what's been talked about in the Trump administration policy that are very human, but it gets at what President Trump does more than other leaders. He gets to the human and visceral level of what is animating a relationship. One of those was the COVID experience. Nothing says irresponsible stakeholder more than developing and deploying a virus, lying about it, manipulating the key international institution that is supposed to keep the world healthy in ways that cost millions of lives and trillions of dollars out of our economies. And to this day, still not really being truthful about it. And it was an immense wake-up call on whether you can really allow your nation's health, but other areas to be subject to the quality control of the People's Republic of China. So we're not going to have an on-off switch of so much dependency on China going to complete independence from on our supply chains tied to the People's Republic of China. But on the things that are absolutely vital to our way of life, our national security, our public health, we have no choice. And it's not out of animus towards China. It's China's leadership has chosen to behave this way. And we just simply, as responsible leaders, can't afford to allow that influence to go unchecked in our own societies, in our own ecosystems. So a big adjustment is coming in that way. Tariffs were mentioned, very important part of the tool set that President Trump will be using. It won't be the only tool in the toolbox, but it is front and center. The first 10% and now increased to 20% tariffs on China are tied to fentanyl. The president has made a promise to fentanyl crisis in America that is fueled by illicit precursors in China. Mine is one of them, but hundreds of thousands of families have lost loved ones due to this. The president made a commitment that he will make China have to change behavior and they will pay for this. And so figuring out what action will be taken by the threat of tariffs to get a policy change in behavior from China is an early test. If the leadership of China chooses to do what it almost always has done, slow roll and ignore and just get back into meetings to try to negotiate, well, that's a very, very important test that they might wish they didn't try. But as far as I can tell, there really isn't any wavering in the president or his team's commitment across the board on this. Again, I lived in the Bush administration for the first 5 years in the White House, saw many leaders come and go, people talking about strategic decisions. I have never seen a cabinet from the president, vice president, secretary of state, secretary of treasury, secretary of defense across the board as unified, and including Homeland Security, across the board is unified on trying to stop this particular death trade, whether it's from the cartels to our south, to the precursors and the money launderers in China. That is an elephant in the room before we get to the other area that the president absolutely has been clear and committed to, and that is the rebalancing of the economic relationship. It's fundamental to what he has thought about and talked about really his entire adult life, especially since he came down that escalator in 2015. But it is just doubled down at this point. The mentioned America First Investment Policy Directive, I think, is extremely meaty and consequential. It's not that long, very worthwhile going through. It will hit at everything from investment in vital infrastructure in the United States. It touches upon inbound and outbound investment concerns or restrictions that might apply, but also opportunities for allies and partners to expand. It embodies a notion of strategic decoupling that Ambassador Bob Lighthizer made popular, but frankly, Xi Jinping began in China very early in his tenure. It was twofold. One was he had kind of a China first mentality anyway. Second was he wanted to sanction-proof his economy. He had studied what had happened in the wake of the Tiananmen Square massacre and international sanctions. He has further studied what has happened to Russia in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And they have tried to look at ways that they would become less vulnerable to the United States in terms of their dependency lines. And so they really have pushed this ball rolling. Really isn't up to us to vote whether someone has declared economic war on us. It's only really our choice to decide whether and how we're going to respond. I don't think that we, again, really have to begin with an indictment of China, but if you want one, there's a book on that. And Heritage has actually done an in-depth research program that looked at the new Cold War, whether people want to talk in those terms or not. I think there's a very substantial research agenda there that makes the case of where we are. But that we're going to have this economic rebalancing. I think President Trump is looking at setting that stage at home and with our key allies. I'm very glad that Jeff was able to go in depth on Prime Minister Modi's visit. I would strongly encourage a study of the Prime Minister of Japan's visit. I think that those were very important examples of how leaders can effectively read the moment and engage effectively with the Trump administration and the new politics that Mike was talking about. And I think that they together show that Trump 2.0 is not isolationism. This is pretty vigorous internationalism, just from a different point of view. And if successful in pushing through this peace plan on Ukraine with the minerals deal that has been talked about, all of these things done are in their own right, but piece by piece by piece, it allows the United States to from a position of relative cooperation, access to the things that we need, better energy abundance, maybe some sanity in having our own refining capabilities instead of sending all of our materials to China to refine to then export back across the Pacific to consume and manufacture ourselves. We've got our work cut out for us, but the president has hit a massive reset button on this, and we'll see how it settles back in. Last but not least, I'll talk just briefly about Taiwan because it seems to be what makes international news and gets people attention. Will there be a conflict in the Taiwan Straits? I'm mindful of the room we are engaging with, where you might be somewhat sensitive to the idea of a major continental power having eyes on an island not that far about whether this can happen. I think all of what we've talked about in this policy agenda strengthens the hands of the first island chain in trying to make deterrence more credible, to make Xi Jinping's options less clear and less easy. And I think that's the name of the game. We don't want that conflict to occur in the first place. We don't want to have a Ukraine scenario where we warn that this could happen, but we are less than prepared, and then we're fighting to catch up after the conflict has broken out. We need to fix our supply chains now. We need to provide capabilities now. We need to awaken neighbors now. And I think that Xi Jinping has done a fine job of that with vigorous territorial and so really it's all
internet line.
That is, I hope, going to reset deterrence in the Taiwan Strait. And we play for time on trying to maintain peace and stability there. But certainly welcome the conversation. I hope that these little vignettes whet the appetite. I realize that you can only go in so much depth in each of these areas, but also grateful for the very full plate you've had from all the other speakers too.
Well, thank you. I hope folks can stick around to take some questions. So I want to kick it back to the Pathfinder team.
Yes, shall we first go through the questions and then go to the Pathfinder team? Is that the proposal?
Yes.
Okay, so
yeah, that'd be great.
Yes, I don't have to mention that again. Yeah, so we have a comment that's to Diana. Diana mentioned the climate change is future, but I feel science and data clearly indicate that it is now. We experience extreme weather events such as wildfires, excessive floods, drought, and melting of glaciers. 2024 was also the hottest year on Earth. Many countries believe that we have to act now, but it is too late and become irreversible. So that is just a comment. We have 5 questions also. Can I go through them one by one?
No, let me.
If I could briefly respond to your comment, we have a series of papers on the Heritage website under climate. We have a climate advisory committee. Had a series of papers, and the temperatures in the world are rising, but we do not believe, and many scientists do not believe, that this is related to greenhouse gases. If the United States stopped producing or using all fossil fuels today, government models show this would make a difference of 0.2 of 1 degree centigrade by the year 2100. Carbon dioxide emissions, we do not think are correlated with tornadoes, sea level rising, which has been rising for 20,000 years. And in some places it's rising, in other places it's decreasing. There are no more hurricanes from greenhouse gases, no more hurricanes than there were about 100 years ago. These papers are all on our website, and I would really encourage you to look at them, because we're spending very large amounts of money, billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. In fact, we're spending trillions of dollars on something that might not actually be related. Poverty is a problem that's with us now. Climate change is a risk that has to be managed. And the world is gradually getting warmer, but we need more air conditioners. We need more fans. We need electricity and running water. We cannot prevent people from getting electricity and running water because of future gradual increases in temperature.
Since we have limited time, may I kindly request the responses to be brief to the extent possible?
Yes, so let me go through the questions. One says Sri Lanka does not fix in a proper statecraft, as my understanding, for the last decade of state policies due to welfare politics. As per President Trump, US is mingled with the debt trap, and EU had an impact on US citizens. Will Donald Trump's economic strategy sustain for the next few decades, or only short-term, or will it be only short-term geopolitical drama? Can I go through all the questions?
Okay, all right.
There's another one which says Sri Lanka is set for national transformation. Politicians are trying it, but bureaucrats are not ready. US government is ready to fire them, who are blocking the Trump strategy. How could you relate US strategy versus Sri Lanka's present government driving force? Maybe because both are related, somebody could answer that.
So Eric, maybe you want to talk about the future of the dollar. And Mike, I don't know if you want to offer any advice about how you drive government transformation.
Yeah, again, I'll be very brief. Look, the president is committed to having dollar dominance globally, but that is in a balance between the ability to manufacture in the United States. Having the world's reserve currency is a privilege. Fully aware of, but it does come with a cost. And so what I think that the purpose of the direction of this administration is to better rebalance and reallocate those costs and benefits to the strength of the US dollar.
Yeah, I would not dare give advice to Sri Lanka on how to reform its own bureaucracy. I've never been to Sri Lanka, but even a country that I visit constantly, Spain, I was on a stage last week and they begged me to give advice. I said, no, because each country is sui generis. I'm not sure that we're going to get it right. I hope we get it right, because this needs to change. I was trying to convince my very distraught liberal friend yesterday, who was saying that this is an enormous increase in executive power. I said, no, executive power is going to remain the same or actually decrease. This actually determine who runs executive power. Is it people accountable, or is it people that are not accountable? But executive power right now is enormous. In fact, what I would like to see, and I think where this should go, is for the legislative power to increase, for legislators to actually write bills that are meaningful, so they don't have to be interpreted by the bureaucrats. But I would never in a gazillion years pretend to tell Sri Lankans how to do this. I just don't know your system well enough. I'm sorry.
Mike, I would say that when I'm asked for advice, I universally say that these countries should get rid of the net zero goals, which is costing them huge amounts of money without any effect. It's deindustrializing their economies, weakening their economies, and sending more commerce to China where it's made in a dirtier way. I think that's one thing we can universally advise other countries to do.
May I suggest, I have my eye on the clock and we are running out of time. As such, may I ask whether Sri Lankan commentators could come up with their comments with regard to the matters that have already been discussed, and take the rest of the questions subsequently. If that is okay, may I first request Professor Rohan Samarajiva to take the floor. Please introduce yourself briefly and then make your comment. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. My name is Rohan Samarajiva. I've lived and worked in the United States in areas of public policy and regulation. I've also, for the last 25 years, been a regulator here in Sri Lanka and been engaged in economic reforms in government and with breaks as usual, in between doing other things, including setting up a think tank that deals with infrastructure issues and trade issues. I can understand America first. So that means that the whole world is going to have a very clear picture that all the national interests are going to be primary and that we should also look after our national interest. Now, let me explain. We are having this conversation with a 10-hour time difference. That means that we are basically on the other side of the world. And ours is an extremely small economy, just 84 billion US dollars, which has gone through a crisis, which contracted and so on. We are barely coming out of bankruptcy. So now in a situation like this, for us to be looking at the trade deficit and looking at tariffs, I think we need to fill out the picture. That is, people who talk about trade deficits, I'm faced with this problem all the time. We run trade surpluses with certain countries, like the United States, and we run trade deficits with other countries like India and so on. So the people who see trade deficits see this as some unmitigated evil. Not necessarily the services deficit. And services. So an advanced economy like the United States, which is quite far away geographically, where the transportation costs and so on are extremely high in terms of trade with Sri Lanka, if it expects that it's going to have a trade or merchandise goods surplus, I think it's a little unrealistic. If you look at the sector that I'm most engaged with, which is telecommunications, digital, things like that, you can see that the American companies, Google, Facebook, AWS, these are the major players. But this stuff doesn't appear in the merchandise account. This appears on the services side. So I think it's a little, and I personally would like our tariffs to go down. I think we got too many, our tariffs should go down. But really, for the United States to be compelling us to bring down our tariffs doesn't make a lot of sense, because you don't sell us that much goods, stuff. So I think there's a little bit of a adjustment that will have to be made. I think if I do advise the government on occasion, I've been telling them, just forget about the Americans, try to realign to the growing Asian markets, because that's what you can do with your goods trade. Now let's take the biggest item that we import, fuel. So I'll segue into the energy side. We do not have any fossil fuel resources, no coal, no gas, no petroleum deposits, nothing. So a full 25% of our import bill is devoted to importing this stuff. I think we have decided to move to renewables. We've been on renewables. I mean, any good year, that's because we are getting our hydropower. And a bad year is when we rely on non-renewables, where our costs go up, the electricity prices go up, the macroeconomic instability increases. So we should go to renewables, not for net zero or anything else, simply out of national interest, because we don't want to be to deal with the volatility of the international fossil fuel markets, and because we simply can't afford these prices. So that's why Sri Lanka has got a 70% renewables goal by 2030, and I think we will do our best to get to that. Because if we keep spending 25% of our entire imports bill on fossil fuels, we are going to be in deep trouble here. So I think that's sort of the perspective that comes from being in a small country with its unique endowments, as our colleagues from Heritage mentioned a little while ago. The way we see the world and our interests are different. And in fact, if the US wants to sell more and more things to us, it's still not going to be very competitive because you are far away. As we all know, the gravity models that are applied to international economics generally say that you trade with people who are near you in terms of goods. But of course, distance doesn't matter when it comes to the kinds of things that I was talking about, data centers, AI, the advertising services provided by these companies, the platform companies. Uber is big here. So all those things are very much here, but they're not going to be covered by tariffs. So lastly, I would say that despite all this, we have the United States as a major source of our exports, a major destination for our exports. That's because we do export relatively high value apparel to the United States. And if there are any tariffs that would be applied, I mean, I looked at this problem as the executive orders are coming out. And if there's some kind of uniform 10% tariff, I think we can live with that. American customers, consumers will pay for it. We'll take a bit of a hit, but we can live with it. But if it is discriminatorily imposed on us, simply because we have a trade deficit with the United States, and I was looking through the list of countries in terms of the magnitude of the deficits, we don't even appear in the first 25 or even first 50, because we are such a tiny economy, right? So I think we need to look at that in a nuanced way and not apply the same rules that the United States applies to big companies, big countries and big economies should not be applied to countries like ours that are far away and very small. Thank you.
I just want to say that hydroelectric power is not the same as wind and solar. It runs continuously. It's very efficient. So my comments about renewables were wind and solar, not hydroelectric.
May I now request Ambassador Ravinath Aryasinghe to make his comments. Please note time is limited. Take no more than 4 minutes, please.
And thank you very much, Ambassador Gunatilaka, and greetings to all of colleagues joining, particularly those from Heritage. Happy to be talking to you. I'm the Executive Director of the Lakshman Kadiragami Institute, which is a think tank which deals with international relations and foreign policy. Formerly was with the Foreign Ministry and served as ambassador to the US, EU, Geneva, and also as foreign secretary. Now, what I thought is to take for the benefit of particularly our guests from the United States, the whole question of China in a context of how we got here. Because and I think Ambassador Gunatilaka will vouch for this because we both served in the United States in the 2004 to, I came a little earlier in 8, he came back in 9. In that period, and at that time, the US-Sri Lanka relationship could walk and chew gum at the same time. But subsequent to the ending of the conflict, it appeared that we were abandoned in some respect. And to make matters a little worse, the whole affront to Sri Lanka led largely with US interests at play, and I know that it was not the Republican Party at the time, kind of put distance in some way. Now, from there, we are today talking about going through 2 phases, because then after that in 2015, there was a change. And then the pendulum swung to the other end. But to very quickly swing back, when it came to rupees and cents, the Hambantota port, which was given for 33 years on lease, we had to give it for 99 years. So what I'm trying to establish is China is big in this, in our equation, not necessarily partly by choice, but partly by compulsion. Now, as we speak today, economic crisis, despite all the havoc it has created, has brought foreign policy at least somewhere to the middle, because we had to get everybody's help to get out of this mess. And therefore, I think that as the US companies are competing because of their quality. During COVID, I was the ambassador in US, and the US told us they didn't need checking to just get the various kits and the mask held with. So therefore, we now have a chance to try to get this right. And I think one way of circumventing the compulsions of trade and tariff would be if the US is to take a little more interest in real, genuine investments in Sri Lanka, because while China is there is nothing to prevent others coming in. Leave the country more open, because we will have nowhere to go. So I think one has to, rather than look at this as a zero-sum element, and now I'm talking US, Sri Lanka, but we have the same issue with India. because China is not going to go away from this equation very easily. And what is necessary is, from a Sri Lankan national interest point of view, that Sri Lanka does not do something inimical to US interests, Indian interests, while we continue whatever engagement we are having with China. And I see that from my experience and now from where I sit as the realistic possible. And that, I think, is much better than any of the countries other than India, which you have in our region, and countries which do not have a problem with China. So the whole world can't be divided, with only though, there are some countries which, for the reasons I told you, have had to deal with China, have had to depend on China to deal with the problems they face. So my suggestion is that what we probably we can't import a lot from the US, but the US already is there in the money market in a big way. As Rohan said, they are in the high-tech industry. They have invested and they are having a lot to do. Maybe, unfortunately, the two big investments which came, Fortress Energy, became a damn squid. And unfortunately, that didn't pick up, which affected, in a reputational sense. We expected that will have a spillover effect. That didn't happen. So I think, and also recently, the IFC's own issues with the Adani Group made the Adani Group go without the IFC loan to do the West Terminal, which they were going to use that, and that is about to come online. So I think it will be helpful if the US, conscious of the very long-standing relationship which has existed over the years, try to recalibrate while we recalibrate ourselves to diversify products, expand our markets, look at how we can facilitate US investment. And that, I think, will be the win-win. And this is not something I'm telling alone. Luger Kerry, at the end of the war, the conflict in Sri Lanka in 2009, in a congressional report, stated this very categorically, that the US can't lose Sri Lanka and that therefore they must balance the relationship between going after this human rights issue in, if I may say so, as an obsession, and on the other hand, kind of not putting their efforts into areas which they really had competitive edge. So I think if we can rectify this, the US-Sri Lanka relationship has a lot of future. And I don't think it needs to be taken as a subset of India's relationship with Sri Lanka. We can deal with India on its own. And I think it's better our dealing with India as India and with the US as US. But that the US is a little more conscious of what went wrong before. And that we both sides don't make the mistakes which we made in the past. We missed the bus in 2009 as the conflict ended. We missed it in 2015. And already, I think, Jeff, who was earlier with us, has written about it. He expected Sri Lanka to be a test case for the free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, what I have told you is why it didn't get there. So I think this is an opportunity, an opening, at a time the country's foreign policy seems more on an even keel, to try to keep that and to consolidate on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I would like to invite Dr. Dayaratna Silva, Executive Director of the Pathfinder Foundation, to say a few words.
Thank you, Ambassador Gunatilaka. Let me introduce myself, my background. I serve about 30 years for the Ministry of Trade, and during that time, I served as the Sri Lankan ambassador to WTO. And therefore, I looked at the, the policy prescription now presented, and we heard from the Heritage Foundation from the two perspectives. One is the global perspective. During my time in Geneva, what we heard, what we were to understand is all about open to trade. Now, what we hear is quite a departure, a new paradigm as presented today. I'm not surprising for that different direction. Understandably, US suffered chronic trade deficit with China, with India, and many other countries. Your manufacturing industries were affected. We quite understand what the redirection of this policy prescription. I must say, Sri Lanka also suffered the similar chronic trade deficit with China, India, and we were enjoying trade surplus with United States of America. But in your, the presentation mentioned rebalancing of the economic relationship. Now, this policy of eye to eye, tariff to tariff, as you have now challenging the WTO very principle of the MFN principle, you have made a solid argument. US has made a solid argument. This mirror tariff policies, application of mirror tariff policies should be configured depending on the size of the economy and the nature of the threat countries like Sri Lanka is currently facing. Today, our share in US market, trade share, is 0.1, which is very insignificant. And looking at that perspective, tariff for tariff policy will do more harm for us, small country like us. Therefore, I would suggest, contrary to what you are proposing, Sri Lanka, as Ambassador Gunatilaka mentioned, we are just coming out of the debt crisis. This debt crisis is partly due to our own policy misstep. At the same time, the global pattern of trade that we were facing. Therefore, I think a special carve-out in your South Asia policy is needed to help to meet the development challenges of the country like small country. With this, I have many other questions, but I will stop here. It is your argument against the MFN rule being applied has been questioned by many partner countries or member countries of the WTO, which we want to understand with further clarification the rationale of this application, as you explained in your project 2025 report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Finally, I would like to invite Admiral Professor Jayantha Columbage. Please note that the time available is very limited. Make your comments. and thereafter we can go back to the question and answer session.
Good morning, everyone. Good evening, everyone, wherever you are. I'm Admiral Jayannath Kolambage, former Chief of Navy, former Foreign Secretary, Ambassador, and it's great to be with everyone talking about a very important topic. Because of the shortage of the time, I will get on with my topic immediately. And we feel that the new Trump administration will have a greater focus on the Indo-Pacific strategy, while you focus on Quad and the AUKUS. In fact, the first nuclear submarine from America is right now here in Perth as part of the first visit of this year. And so in the Pacific strategy, Sri Lanka is occupying a very geographically interested and important location. And therefore, as Ravinath mentioned, I think we need to deal you need to deal with Sri Lanka separately, not consider it as part of another country. However, this region is critically important maritime space because we know the statistics. 70 to 75% of energy, 50% of containers, 35% of bulk cargo for the world is transported just across south of Sri Lanka. And therefore, except a lot of things happening in the Western Indian Ocean. And we need to keep this sanctity. We need to maintain this order for the sake of Sri Lanka, for the sake of many countries, and for the sake of the world economy. That is the bottom line. Now, when you talk about strategy's main focus is to counter China, Sri Lanka cannot be part of it completely. However, I feel there are many areas in Indo-Pacific strategy that we can work together, especially combating maritime crime, protecting the maritime environment. These are areas which we all like because ocean is the lifeline for Sri Lanka. And if there is maritime crime like piracy and countering illegal narcotic trade, there are many areas in the Indo-Pacific strategy Sri Lanka can work with with USA. I think that is something that we need to really focus on. But if it is the objective is to counter China, we really cannot be embracing it wholeheartedly. Now we know that one thing missing in the Indian Ocean is that every major power is having a maritime strategy for the Indian Ocean, but we don't have the Indian Ocean maritime strategy by the Indian Ocean littorals for the Indian Ocean. This is, I think, one of the major problems we have. Now, we need to work very closely. Of course, India is there, the major power, and we need to work very closely together to have our own strategy. I think recently in the Indian Ocean Conference held in Oman, Mr. Jaishankar, Foreign Minister, mentioned the word coordinated flotilla. That means we should all have our own policies, coordinated strategies, and to move forward as one. So therefore, my submission is Indian Ocean is critically important to the entire world, and Sri Lanka is in a very important geographical location. And many of the aspects of the Indo-Pacific strategy are relevant to many countries because our interests coincide there. So we can work together. However, the objective of countering China, it is a problem for a country like Sri Lanka. So thank you very much. I will stop here because of the time limitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have several questions from the audience. Gayatri, can you please come up with 2 or 3 questions first, and then we will see whether we can.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, yeah, there's a question which says, what is Trump's South Asia strategy writ large? Does it involve relegating agency to India to manage South Asian affairs, as Jeff Smith hinted? Also, what can the island expect in relation to the Quad and USA's engagement in the Indian Ocean?
Steve, do you want to share any thoughts you might have on that?
Well, I would frame it a little differently. I don't think that the way the president has been talking about this, or his team, or ours for that matter, would talk about it relegating the entire region to one power. And just to sort of address this and some of the other issues that came up together, the idea that America first is not America alone doesn't apply just to unilateralism. It also applies to economic engagement. So it shouldn't just be U.S. Sri Lankan economic engagement, but those that are on our side when being true responsible stakeholders on whether it's on tech or respect for human dignity, other kinds of standards come together on this. So we would work with our other allies in the Indo-Pacific and Japan, Korea, Taiwan to some extent, Australia too, to encourage the team to consider those kinds of investments as well. And that helps kind of round out the input for Sri Lanka. And in terms of the economic engagement, of course, to the president, he is very focused on the trade imbalances. It's just the way he is. It's something that every leader is going to have to deal with. It's somehow out of the 1980s on his mind, and that's going to be what it's going to be. But in essence, I think it's a very common sense value for value exchange notion. And so if you can put into good words what the value proposition is for what you add to the American family, the American community, to America's well-being, collective defense or deterrence, those kinds of things, all of that fits into a clearer sense of a balanced value for value exchange. And so hopefully that helps. But I think that the engagement with India is going to be substantial, and Heritage has a project to look in a deeper strategic way on the U.S.-India partnership to see where it might go and grow. But that doesn't leave the literal behind. I think you made a very important point about the maritime security issues of the littoral states in the Indian Ocean. Definitely worthy of further conversation on that front.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So there is another question. To what level was the NED involved in the 2022 protest movement? And to what level, if any, did US aid have an influence on the prospect of the current political administration in Sri Lanka being elected?
Eric, I don't know if you want to make any additional comments on the aid issue.
Yeah, look, SIPE is part of the National Endowment for Democracy family. We worked in Sri Lanka for years on business and regulatory policy. Undoubtedly, some NED grantees were involved in some of that because they support public policy issues. And, some IRI folks, the International Republic Institute, National Democratic Institute, all of those folks will be involved in some sort of process because they work with local citizens. There's nothing nefarious about it, and it's pretty transparent. Look, to the criticism of the NED that you see on Twitter and other areas, I would just say that the U.S. engages in this way. You can read what USAID is funding. You can read what NED is funding. And it's out there, right? They aren't necessarily discovering anything new. I'm more concerned about, if we're turning to the United States, if you don't think that the Chinese and Chinese state enterprises and Russian state enterprises don't have lobbyists working for them on K Street, I think that's naive. And so, look, the Americans have done it this way. I don't know if they'll continue to do it this way in supporting interests, but we'll see going forward. Steve, I don't know. Maybe you have a thought on this.
Well, I think that the DOGE effort is definitely worth continued monitoring. I think the USAID, as it has been known, is shattered in a way that I don't think can be put back together. And that's probably for the good. Whatever good was done by way of that mechanism can and should be done by other mechanisms going forward. So whether those responsibilities go to the State Department, the Defense Department, other arms of government, or to the private sector, we have a very wealthy and robust private sector that can do a lot of these kinds of things and doesn't need to involve the government. But very clearly, we had a lack of transparency and accountability that we require of others and we have to demand of ourselves. And that, if no, for no other reason, USAID, its leadership profoundly failed. And so that's going to be an ugly lesson for others to watch as we regroup on that front. But I think what's been exposed so far is fairly fatal to the organization as we've known it so far.
Thank you. We have several more questions, but given the time factor, we can, I think, have one more question.
Yes.
Gayatri?
Sri Lanka currently lacks a national security, defense, or maritime strategy. Although there have been some attempts to develop these strategies, they have not been successful thus far. Given this situation, what challenges do larger powers like the USA encounter when dealing with smaller states like Sri Lanka in the absence of a strong national security strategy and policy?
Thanks. Maybe, first of all, let me thank everybody for participating, the Americans for hanging in there for so long. And I know we're out of town. So I'll just take this last question. I do think it's a serious issue because I go back to what the Admiral said and to what Steve both said, which is where is the real value proposition in U.S.-Sri Lankan relationship? And it is in the maritime space, both in the commercial and the security space. And so how we maximize that relationship really does require Sri Lanka conceptualizing how its larger security structure fits into that space. And, you know, the United States has been one of the preeminent supporters of this concept of free and open. I mean, you recently heard, for example, President Trump, one of his first statements on this, talk about the value of the India to Italy, corridor and the importance of building out increased throughput capacity through the Middle East. So obviously, the Indian Ocean is a critical component of this. Free and open is not just the concept of a nice thing everybody gets. It also, particularly from a U.S. perspective, engenders a responsibility to contribute to keeping it free and open. So it's not just a benefit; it's also an obligation to the beneficiaries of participation in that. I think Sri Lanka has an important role from both the commercial and a security perspective. Excuse me. And I think you make an excellent point to say is lacking that underlying structural framework of how does Sri Lanka see itself fitting into this in a way that it can articulate to its partners and allies. I think that is an issue. So I would hope, for example, that maybe in one of the follow-up things, because we have great expertise on this, the Heritage Foundation, in our Asian Center, that maybe this is something that and in our defense center, because our defense folks couldn't be here today. Maybe this is an area where we could partner in the future and have some deeper discussions. So let me just conclude by thanking again the Pathfinder Foundation for making the initiative for this conversation. And as you can tell, I'm not 1,000% over my.
Thank you very much indeed. On part of the Pathfinder Foundation, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to the Heritage Foundation for rounding up an excellent team that provided information with regard to the policies of the new Trump administration, for which we are very grateful. Having listened to the presentations that were made, we heard about the situation with regard to US aid. In regard to that, something came to my mind that relates to the projection of soft power by the US. As we all know, China has spent hundreds of billions of dollars with regard to its pet project, Belt and Road Initiative. We have also recently heard that Japan proposes to invest about $70 billion between now and 2030 for covering Indo-Pacific region. Now, with the situation with regard to the US aid, I wonder how does the US propose to project its soft power with what has happened to US aid? Are we to consider that after the review period, US aid will be revived, or that responsibility will be handed over to some other agency? Is something that we ask ourselves. Anyway, I would like to thank the Heritage Foundation for this opportunity for us to exchange views. And we also hope that in time to come, we will be afforded a similar opportunity to exchange views on important matters relating to the US policy as well as the situation prevailing in the Indian Ocean region. Thank you very much indeed. It is almost, I think, 9:15 in the evening here in Sri Lanka. I think we can bring this meeting to a close and thank the audience who joined us and stayed with us until this time. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jana. Yeah. It must be quite late for you, isn't it?
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah, it's nearly midnight for me. It's okay.
Right.
Enjoyed it. Nice seeing you, Ravinath. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Professor. Is Professor Rohan Samarjeeva still there or gone? Anyway, thanks. Thank you. How many questions did we